Quick note before we jump into the genius of Edward Carey. I have, at the time of recording, only read 2 of his novels, and as far as I'm aware, he's written, I think, 7? But these 2 are easily accessible in the UK, published by Gallic, who have done an amazing job, and the others are harder to get. And the other reason I want to talk about them right now is because these 2 books are fresh on my mind, and they have left an enormous impact on me. So rather than wait around to when I finally get to all of his other books and read all of them, I thought, no, this man has left such an incredible impact on my mind that I want to talk about his genius as a writer now. This was enough to really make me feel weak and vulnerable in the best way possible. So let's talk about the genius of Edward Carey. Edward Carey is a British writer who has lived in Texas for a long time. He teaches there, he has written multiple novels, and he also draws the art for those novels as well, which we'll come to. And the first novel of his that I was made aware of was Little. I remember this book coming out, published by Gallic, as I said, but a few months ago Gallic revealed that they were reprinting this in a beautiful hardcover. The colours of the cover are slightly different, and it has sprayed edges. And much like when I talked about M.L. Rio's If We Were Villains, I had a feeling that this book was going to be a very big deal to me before I ever read it. And I thought, now that this gorgeous hardcover is coming out, now's the time for me to finally read it, and so I asked for it for Christmas. I visited my parents over Christmas, and through Christmas Day and Boxing Day, I read this entire novel. And there was a moment on Boxing Day where I was like 90% through the book, and something happened that made me break down in tears. I can count on one hand the amount of times I've cried at a book since I was a teenager, but this moment hit me so hard I was sobbing, and then my mum came in with a sandwich. Which was really lovely. I was supposed to spend Christmas Day playing Pokemon, but instead I just read all of this. And by the end of it, I was left in pieces. I felt like a cloth that had been ripped to shreds. And I'm really happy about that. Little is the fictionalized biography of the woman who eventually became the legendary Madame Tussauds. The first of her waxworks museums was opened in London, and it's still there, and we typically call it Madame Tussauds. But Madame Tussauds was originally French, and she spent years living in Switzerland, and then France again, and then England. And this novel tracks her journey through those places, primarily setting itself in Paris. And I read up on her a little bit online, and a lot of what's covered here is fictional, because it's a novel. But it takes the framework of Madame Tussauds' life and creates something so haunting and beautiful. We begin with her just having been born, and her father goes off to war. When he returns, he is traumatized, he is injured, and he has no lower jaw. And he has to wear this prosthetic jaw that is attached to him by these hinges. And Carey draws that in the book. And there are a lot of sketches all the way through this. Every chapter has multiple sketches in it, drawing from Little's perspective, and Little becomes Madame Tussauds. We'll come to that. The world that she is seeing and the way that she feels about it and the way that she interprets it. We get sketches all the way through that Edward Carey himself drew as though he were Little. And so our first look at her life is tragedy. It is war, it is a family ripped apart, a man ripped apart, quite literally. After the death of her father, Little and her mother go to Bern in Switzerland, where they kind of work for and live with this very enigmatic, closed-off, awkward man called Dr. Curtius. Curtius is an anatomist, and he is obsessed with the human body. And one thing that he admires about Little is that she is unafraid of bodies, body parts, organs, blood, all of the gory aspects of life. She doesn't shy away from them, she finds it all quite fascinating, or at the very least, just doesn't care. After her mother hangs herself, and Little depicts that hanging in a sketch where she replaces her mother's body with a wood pigeon, and that really hit me hard in a strange way. She then works full-time for Dr. Curtius. And the reason that the wood pigeon hit me so hard is because you have this little girl who's 8-10 years old. Her mother has died, and she interprets that death as something else, as a way to cope. She struggles to understand, she struggles to see it, she struggles to internalize it, and so she draws it as a wood pigeon, hanging by a bit of string by its neck. This really got to me. This was the first time that I was really hit by this novel. This little girl from here on continues to live and work and get closer to Dr. Curtius. and eventually the two of them move to Paris. And it's from here that you can kind of see how Little eventually becomes Madame Tussaud. Dr. Curtius's interest in anatomy, his ability to create perfect wax interpretations of people's heads, busts, and later entire bodies. It becomes a business. It becomes something that he can monetize, something that he can survive off. And it even turns him into a kind of local celebrity in Paris. And Little continues to learn from him. And the journey that she goes on as an individual, inspired by him, learning from him, is truly remarkable. She even ends up working for a princess of Versailles. And at this point, Little is around the age of 20, and their relationship is an incredibly intimate and pseudo-sexual one. But back home in Paris, Little has also formed an intimate relationship with a boy that she has kind of grown up with through her time in Paris. Her vulnerability is what really gets me here. The fact that she forms these bonds with people. The fact that her trauma is so exposed. She's a young woman who faces so much throughout her life, who is forced to face things, who continues to work and learn and grow. She's an inspiration. The people that she meets are such fascinating and strange characters. In a lot of ways, this feels surreal and fantastical sometimes because the people around her, including Dr. Curtius, don't quite behave in the way that you expect people to. It kind of feels sometimes like a Tim Burton film. Everyone just is a bit off. There is a macabre, caricature nature to it. If this was ever adapted to film, the film would have to be stop motion, if that makes any sense at all. Because the people don't quite talk and move and think as you assume people do. And Little loves these people, and is kind of loved by them. And her great villain in the whole story is Dr. Curtius's eventual love interest, a widowed woman who is incredibly cruel to her. And while all of this is going on, she is simply referred to as Little. She's a simple girl who is overlooked. In that way, it feels kind of Dickensian. She works and she toils and she struggles and she learns, she keeps her eyes open, and she looks for opportunities to grow and change and meet people and learn from them and bond with them. There is so much simple humanity in this novel. I felt blessed to have read it, as ridiculous as that sounds. It encouraged me to feel rather than interpret, rather than criticize, rather than feel entertained. I just felt. This was a novel that rolled all of your emotions out on a table and would just pick each one of them up and play with it. That's what it felt like. All of my emotions were laid bare, and the novel would just toy with them, one by one. I would feel such raw, passionate anger, sadness, joy. I'd feel inspired. I'd even feel jealous sometimes. This is a novel of pure emotion. And Edward Carey's gorgeous sketches really help put you in the mind of Little as she sees the world, as she interprets it, while also reminding you that she's an incredibly talented artist and interpreter of the life around her that she sees every day. I can't say enough amazing things about Little. This is a book of feeling. And continuing that trend is The Swallowed Man, again written and drawn by Edward Carey and published by Gallic in the UK. This is his interpretation of the story of Pinocchio, entirely from the perspective of Geppetto after having been swallowed by the whale. He is in the belly of the beast, and he spends his time describing his environment and telling us his backstory, the story of Pinocchio and how Pinocchio came to be, and what kind of plans he has for the future. It's a short novel. It's about 150 pages. I read it in a day. And once again, it is full of sketches. It's an odd story, slightly surreal. But once again, it's a story that has you feeling. It's a story that asks for your sympathy, and your fear, and your hope, and your pity. While it is based on the story of Pinocchio, and I've never read the original novel, we don't spend that much time with Pinocchio. We don't spend that much time retreading that story. Instead, we are in the mind of Geppetto. He describes himself. He describes his own past. He describes what he looks like and how he feels. And we also get a lot of time just kind of wandering around this world inside the belly of a whale. Very early on, he finds a ship that has been swallowed at some point. He goes into the ship and he finds a way to illuminate his surroundings. He has wax candles and some flint and he finds the captain's cabin. And in that cabin is a diary. And he reads the captain's diary and gets to know him in a sense. But he also writes in any space he can find this story in the captain's journal. He adds his own story to it. So everything we read in this is actually being written in the margins or in the back pages of this captain's journal. He studies the cabin, he studies the ship, and he learns about this man. And he starts to bond with him. He notices that there is an owl, a taxidermied owl, in the captain's cabin, and he wonders, why? Why is this thing here? What was it for? And he starts to build a relationship to this man that he never knew and doesn't know what became of him. It's a strange tale that feels like it just wanders. You get a man who is wandering through a rotting ship in the middle of a whale, while also wandering through his own memories, his thoughts, his feelings, his ponderings on stuff he just happens to remember, people he remembers, instances from his past, hopes that he has. He wonders how he can get out, how he can survive down here, how he got here in the first place, just constant wondering and pondering. And I was so taken by the way that he thought and felt. I so enjoyed being in this strange little man's mind, this man who at some point in his life brought a puppet to life, that I just wanted to keep going. The book could have been twice as long and I wouldn't have minded. I enjoyed just living in his mind and living in this strange place, as bleak and lonely as it was. What I get from the stories of Edward Carey is this sense of raw emotion, this sense of feeling, the idea that what we feel as people is what really matters. Our experiences, our relationships, our traumas, they all lead to feeling. What is important is not what we think, but how we feel. The ways in which we bond with people, the successes and failures that we experience, all of it leads to an emotional response. And all the while, we are just bonding with these people in these stories. And so it's not just about how we feel, but how other people feel, and how we react to that, and how we interpret that. You have a novel inspired by the real life of a very legendary woman, and a reinterpretation of the story of the man who created Pinocchio. Very different things. Very different ways of seeing the world. One inspired by fiction, the other inspired by fact and history. But they both amount to the same thing, which is that our experiences inform who we are, and who we are is what we feel. And that's the genius of Edward Carey. And the fact that in both of these books you have sketches that he drew that serve as a deeper window into the minds and the eyes and the feelings of these characters helps you dig even deeper into your own feelings as well as you read. I never feel as naked and bare and raw and exposed as I do when I read the stories of Edward Carey. His stories ask you to feel vulnerable, and it's not a comfortable feeling, but that's okay. I'm so grateful to him for these stories, and I can't wait to read everything else he's ever done. Edward Carey is a man who feels and asks us to feel, and I'm very grateful. Now it's time for my Patreon book recommendation of the week. This recommendation comes from Mika Gottstein, and the book is Identity by Mithu M. Sanyal, a favourite book by a German author that has been translated into English. I cannot vouch for the translation, but the novel is fantastic. Protagonist Nivedita is a blogger who writes about racism and tits. Her pen name is Identity, and her posts are basically conversations with the goddess Kali, because Kali has appeared to Nivedita in a dream when she was a child, and she has felt a connection ever since. She talks to her in her head all the time. Nivedita has a German mother and an Indian father, and has never felt like she belonged anywhere. But then, Nivedita takes post-colonial studies at university and meets Indian lecturer Saraswati. A whole new world opens up, a whole new life, a whole new self that is finally being heard. But then, Saraswati is unmasked. She is not Indian at all. Not a person of colour, but a white German who dyes her skin and hair. Neve doesn't know what to think or feel. If Saraswati's not real, does that mean that what Nivedita has learned from her is not real either? She feels incredibly hurt and betrayed, but the longer she talks to Saraswati, the clearer it becomes that she still loves her mentor, but also needs to free herself from her in order to find herself. Saraswati herself doesn't understand all the fuss. For her, race is just a construct that empowers structures of domination, and she sees it as an act of liberation to free yourself from it. She seems to genuinely believe that she is not white, that her identity is some sort of trans identity. She is transracial. She is perplexed when this gets her into hot water with the queer community. This book sounds wild, in a really, really good way, and the kind of thing that is going to conjure up a lot of thoughts and feelings in a very philosophical sense. Probably something that's going to be quite challenging, especially if you're a member of the queer community or a person of colour, and especially if you're both. I haven't read it. I hadn't even heard of it before Mika recommended it, but I'm so glad that they did. Alright, check that out if you're interested. Please read the books of Edward Carey. He is a master. And subscribe for books.